Where in the world do you find innovation? Well, according to this year's Global Innovation Index produced by INSEAD and the World Intellectual Property Organization, the top 3 countries are Switzerland, Sweden, and Singapore. But with today's seismic shifts in financial markets, the global economy, and technology, it's important for all countries to embrace innovation. Well, joining us next on INSEAD Knowledge to tell us a little bit more are INSEAD Professor Sumitra Dutta and Francis Gurry, who is the Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you.
As we said, the top 3 countries this year are Switzerland, Sweden, and Singapore, and that's actually the same as last year. But these are wealthy countries, but innovation is not necessarily just the domain of those who can afford it. Now, you looked at 141 countries. Where did you find innovation in maybe some unwealthy countries where the environment was less than supportive?
Well, there's quite a series of them, I think, and some in the unwealthy countries, and I think what we notice is a markedly improved performance, in particular on the group of countries called the innovation learners, which is quite a wide spectrum. It includes countries from the traditionally developing countries, also some countries from the transition economies of Central Europe. I think one of the interesting things about the rankings, and you mentioned the top 3, as well as some of the innovation learners, is that the top 3 are all small economies. And a suggestion is, of course, that it's a little bit easier to manage when you're a small economy.
Well, you do see a fairly, let's say, significant divide between the high-income economies, at least many of them, and the low-income economies. The high-income economies tend to be the innovation leaders, and this is due to a wide range of factors that have historically enabled them to keep those positions. They have often benefited from very stable macroeconomic climates. They have a very well-educated population, good institutional frameworks. They have a well-educated population who are willing to invest, and businesses are willing to invest in more in R&D and so on. At the same time, what you see are examples of more emerging economies who are starting to realize the importance of innovation.
You kind of have the necessity as the mother of invention working here.
There are 2 sort of forces driving innovation. So one is you have a technology push. So countries can create new technologies, invent new technologies, and those new technologies create new markets. For example, you invent the laser, and the laser creates a whole new range of innovative applications. The other is a market pull, where you have specific context. Let's say the environment requires some solutions, and the solutions creates opportunities for people to repackage and recombine existing technologies to create the right kind of market-facing solutions. So if you look at, for example, in India or China or many emerging economies, you need to create new products and services by combining existing technologies. The prepaid telephone card is a very good example of that. So traditionally what you saw was emerging markets were better at the market pull innovations. But what is happening now is many emerging markets are realizing that they need to also invest in the technology creation, the technology push innovations, which traditionally was the forte and the domain of more developed, rich economies.
The report shows some divisions that would indicate perhaps a multi-speed Europe. North and West doing well, East catching up, but the South falling behind. How do you explain this?
Europe is, of course, multiple countries together. But if you combine all of it together, is approximately similar in size to the US. So if you look at even the US, there are wide differences in performances across different states. So the way a lot of the national data collection is done, the way the exercise is conducted, we tend to focus on the nation state as a unit of analysis. Clearly, there's a question in terms of how much you can bring it down to a lower level analysis in terms of regions or states. So it's quite natural in a way that you will see differences across Europe emerging across different countries, which will happen because of history and legacies. But at the same time, what is interesting is today, in the context of the more the fiscal crisis and the economic crisis in many parts of Europe, that is being reflected in some of the investment decisions that are being taken, and that is accentuating the divide between, let's say, Northern Europe that is more further ahead in innovation and Southern Europe that is traditionally a little bit further behind.
You mentioned the U.S. has falling behind, and in fact it slid into 10th place. Canada fell out of the top 10 altogether. Is this a result of a drop in the amount of money being put into education or research and development?
The first point is the US continues to be a leader. So that's very clear. The position is in the top 10. It's probably the only large economy, a large population, large country there in the top 10 very clearly. At the same time, what is a little disturbing is you look at the longer term trend, the US's relative position and relative competitiveness in many of the factors underlying innovation is slipping, especially in areas, for example, in investments in education.
So what do the top 3 countries have that the others don't?
Well, you see remarkable consistency amongst the countries that come in the top 15. So what you see is a common set of strong enablers in these markets. You also see a fairly strong degree of linkages across different elements. So the whole ecosystem connecting the different innovation actors sort of functions more seamlessly and more effectively in these economies.
How did you change the rankings this year? You added new countries, you must have tweaked the methodology. What did you do and why?
If you look at innovation, the phenomenon of innovation itself is innovating continuously. And I always say that innovation is innovating. And that's because views about innovation have changed, evolved significantly.
Yep, absolutely.
If you went back 10 years, the view of innovation very much was limited product innovation conducted by scientists, typically in the R&D labs of an organization. And today that view is very constraining. That is still innovation, but innovation has become much more wider, much more global, much more horizontal. So this year we, as in every year, we keep on trying to update the model, update the variables, get the most recent data possible. We try and understand if there are new variables available every year. And in particular, this year we have made 2 substantial enhancements. One is in the whole area of ecological sustainability in the infrastructure element, because we do believe that ecological sustainability is very important for sustaining innovation. If you don't have that element inside your country's capacity, you might succeed in the short term, not in the long run. That's a very important element. The second one we've added really is in the creative output side, trying to look at the online creativity. We all know how big a space that is today and how active citizens and various companies are in the space. So we're trying to also identify variables that can measure and capture the online creativity.
You've also developed something you call the Innovation Efficiency Index, which benchmarks countries which do well despite the lack of support within the environment. How does this index apply?
In the Global Innovation Index study, we have the overall index, which is an average of the country's performance or country's ranking on the input conditions and the country's performance in the output conditions. So that's an overall average measure of performance. But then we also have another index called the Global Innovation Efficiency Index. And the innovation efficiency specifically compares the ratio of the output versus the input conditions. So this year, for example, China and India appear as number 1 and number 2 in the Innovation Efficiency Index, even though China and India in the overall index come positioned in the 30s and the 60s. And the reason is because these 2 economies, they are producing disproportionately higher levels of outputs innovation as compared to the overall input conditions. And the reason they're able to do so is because they often have excellent islands of innovation inside the economies that are driving and pushing forward the outputs. So they're showing how even a upper middle income or lower middle income economy can create world-class innovation outputs, and the Innovation Efficiency Index gives us a better measure and better angle into understanding innovation in many of the emerging markets.
How did the BRIC countries fare, or Africa? There's been a lot of talk about the potential here. There's been a lot of investment. What did you find?
On the whole, the BRIC economies are doing very well. And China is ranked very high, and that's the highest ranked of the BRIC economies. But clearly, a cause for concern is that some of the BRIC economies are showing signs of slippage in the overall innovation index rankings. India is one example of that, and even other economies like Brazil and Russia, they show some weaknesses that are more structural in these countries. If these BRIC economies do not pick up and realize the innovation potential, the global recovery could perhaps be threatened, or in fact, the global economy may not reach its full potential.
Yeah. Well, as far as Africa is concerned, of course, it's 53 countries, so it's rather difficult to generalise about a lot of them. But there are certain common characteristics, and those common characteristics are, of course, they're very low income for the most part, exception perhaps of South Africa. Very low income, resource-based, primary resource-based. So innovation has not been its number one priority up until now. There are life and death priorities for many of these countries. Most of the LDCs are located in Africa. And I think the challenge is a challenge of a slow, long-term building of capacity to innovate, and a slow, long-term building of capacity to add value to the resource base that exists. And adding that value is going to come through innovation.
Francis, why is the World Intellectual Property Organization involved in this index?
Because the reason we have intellectual property is innovation. You know, broadly speaking, innovation costs resources to produce, human and financial resources. But once it's produced, it's easily appropriated by anyone. It's what we call a private good in production and a public good in consumption. And so to encourage people to make the investment in innovation, intellectual property grants the exclusive right of appropriation over the fruits of the innovation for a limited period of time. So the whole purpose of intellectual property is innovation or cultural creativity in the case of copyright. So this is why we're here, to reinforce that intellectual property is not just something that's there as an end in itself, it's a means to an end. If you like, we're called the World Intellectual Property Organization, but that's a bit like calling the World Health Organization the World Vaccines Organization. You know, you have a vaccine for a reason. It's painful, and you have intellectual property for a reason, and the reason is innovation.
Let me end by asking you, kind of looking forward into your crystal ball, what do countries need to do to ensure that innovation flourishes?
I think one of the things that we need to think about is this institutional question of how to encapsulate the phenomenon of innovation in an appropriate policy structure.
From our studies looking at the Global Innovation Index for the last few years, you know, the index itself captures some of the key areas where countries need to focus on. You know, you have the infrastructure, you have the macroeconomic, political, institutional frameworks, you have the human capital, you have the business and the market conditions in the economy. So those 5 input conditions are some of those elements. But if you ask what is the most important element, the most important element clearly boils down to people. So if a country is able to develop its own human talent, if it's able to attract the best talent from the world, of the region, if it's able to create the conditions for allowing these own people and also perhaps in some cases foreign talent, global talent, to prosper in the economies in the region, I think that combination of good people creates all kinds of positive spin-offs. And capital follows people, and good people find markets for their ideas, and a lot of very good things happen as a consequence of that. So if I had to condense the critical success factor to one element, I would say it's really the ability of an economy to believe in and to invest in its own people.
Francis and Sumitra, thank you very much for being with us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.
Shane.